Well, it seems like my previous 2 Falcom port reports have scared Digital Foundry into making their own East 10 tech breakdown before me. But I'm not going to go down without a fight, John Linneman. And since I've done videos on the other NISA-made PS5 ports, I figured why not do one on the Cold Steel series too, specifically their new ports for Cold Steel 3 and 4. This time round though, I'm gonna try and keep everything as short and sweet as possible. Thanks to NIS America for the codes, by the way. For starters, are Cold Steel 3 and 4 even worth playing? And the answer is absolutely. While they are definitely weaker compared to other games in the Trail series in my opinion, they're still incredibly good games and definitely worth playing for any JRPG fan. Cold Steel 3 does have a few pacing problems due to it setting up for a big payoff in the next game, and Cold Steel 4 has a overly bloated cast due to being the culmination of the 8 previous games' story threads all converging together, but outside of that, there is a incredibly fun turn-based and RPG system, a cast of colourful and endearing characters, and a narrative that, while a little messy at times, definitely feels like a grand sort of conclusion to 15 plus years of storytelling. They're both very flawed but ultimately still great games that I'd definitely recommend. That being said, how do these new PS5 ports stack up? Now, the original releases both ran at a mostly solid 60 FPS at 1080p on a base PS4 and at 1800p on a PS4 Pro, which is also what the PS4 version runs at when played on a PS5. So in terms of obvious things like frame rate and resolution, these PS5 ports don't really have too much room to improve outside of that 20% res boost up to 4K, which may seem like a lot, but at such high resolutions, the improvement is relatively small, especially at further viewing angles that you'd have for a TV. That being said, it's not unnoticeable, it's just not as much as you might think. And with how the PS4 Pro version will scale to a 4K TV, you're essentially picking between a softer, less detailed, but also less aliased image versus a crisper, more detailed image, but with slightly more noticeable jaggies. Outside of this, pretty much everything else matches console settings. Shadow resolution, shadow rendering distance, shadow filtering, level of detail settings, etc. are all exactly the same as the PS4 version, barring one thing in particular. When playing the PS4 versions of Falcom's games at 4K, for some reason they tend to have their colours look a little bit washed out. My assumption is that this is some sort of optimization thing, but since the PS5 will always run the Pro version and then super sample it back down to 1080p if you don't have a 4K television, it means that you'll always get that washed out look, even if it does mean that you get a really nice 1080p out of it. It was something you could partially remedy by turning down the in-game brightness and turning it up on your TV, but that's kind of annoying to just do for one game, and it only half fixes the problem. On PS5, however, this colour problem just isn't a thing that you have to worry about, and both games look a lot more vibrant because of it, which is especially nice considering it's using an anime art style. Other positives about this collection that apply to both games in general is that it includes all of the costume and cosmetic DLC, something that I don't particularly care all that much for, especially on a first time playthrough, since I want to kind of keep the characters looking how they're supposed to look. But there is a pretty good range of different stuff that you can use, and I especially like stuff like the classic Randy and Tita costumes, and it's just nice to have these available by default. The only things that aren't included in the DLC by default are the extra items or the level up material stuff, the booster packs and time saver stuff, the stuff that just kind of ruins the balancing of the game and I really don't think is all that worth it. So yeah, it's not a big deal that that stuff ain't there. What's also maybe quite cool is that both games come on one disc, which can be a positive or negative depending on what sort of collector you are. Actually, this is Kraftium Post. I have no idea if it's one disc or two discs that just happen to share a box. I can't seem to find anything on it. But either way, it's still just one box, so that's all that's going to be on your bookshelf or whatever. And with this in mind, that I feel like it's important to point out that even though this is a full price collection, Trails of Cold Steel 3-on-4 on the PS4 together are still more expensive, probably due to rarity, so unlike Ys 8 and Ys 9, this is actually a cheaper alternative if you're looking for both games. And this version is just putting more physical copies out there into the general ecosystem, so it is good for game preservation as well. Now, in my previous videos, I mentioned how while the porting process to stronger consoles does make graphical improvements, every port has the potential to introduce new bugs and problems, especially if said port is based off another port that is not the original. And unfortunately, we do have a few of those problems here. Granted, these do have the chance to get patched out at some point, and in fact, the worst problem in this collection already has been patched out while I was working on this video. So now we'll move on to the cons of this release, and I'm going to get a few of the common questions I got on my previous videos out of the way first. No, there is no free upgrade or paid upgrade for that matter. No, achievements do not carry over. And no, there's no cross saves. However, the PS5 version of Cold Steel 4 can use PS4 saves when starting a new game for the save transfer from Cold Steel 3, and can get those save file bonuses from the PS4 ports from Cold Steel 1 and 2. Now, the really bad problem that has now been patched out, but will still probably be on the disc for the physical release, was a problem with Cold Steel 3 specifically, where the game was either running at 1080p or was displayed at 4K but running certain effects at lower resolutions or something. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to investigate it too much before the patch went out. But basically, what it looked like was happening was that stuff like the mild outlines on characters were rendered at a lower resolution than the actual rest of the game, which basically made everything look like a grainy, pixelated mess. Unfortunately, the game updated before I was able to get any footage, and since my review code is obviously digital, it's not like I can delete the patch. It's a really odd problem, especially with how quickly it was fixed, and with the fact that it's just not a thing in the Cold Steel 4 port. Either way, for your average player, it's not going to be much of a problem unless you're deciding to take the game with you to a deserted island or something. The other big problem, albeit slightly less than the resolution thing in Cold Steel 3, is that both games seem to have a bit of a hitching problem. The frame rate will occasionally just plummet for a fraction of a second at seemingly random places. I wasn't able to recreate it at any of the places that I noticed it occurred, but while the locations of where it happens isn't consistent, what is consistent is how frequently it happens, being every 10 seconds or so while running around. My guess is it's some sort of streaming issue, because it did seem to lessen the more I ran back and forth through an area, but it never completely goes away. Now, the hitching isn't anywhere near as bad as something like Jedi Survivor's PC port, and it's also not as harmful since the game is turn-based, but obviously it's not ideal, and it's really distracting in my opinion, and kind of ruins these ports depending on how sensitive you are to this stuff. And I really hope they're able to patch this out. And there's one other problem that I also noticed as well, which I don't think they are going to be patched out because it's probably just the nature of this port and how it's been built. But hopefully this is a problem that is likely to be ignored and overlooked by the player, so shouldn't be a problem. And that's that certain voice files seem to have this awful compression on them. It's not all of them, it's just very specific ones. It's usually affecting characters who have slightly deeper voices than everybody else, but essentially these voice lines sound like the mic is popping and that the bass is boosted all the way up for whatever reason. It might be one of those things that you can only really hear when you're actively trying to listen to it, and that's what I was doing when I was trying to break down everything about this port. So maybe it isn't the worst thing ever, but I'll put a sound clip side by side for comparison here.
Yeah, but Arios, Risha, and Noel caused enough of a distraction to take some of the heat off my back.
We're glad to help. But we're the ones who should be thanking you. It's encouraging to have you here with us.
Yeah, but Arios, Risha, and Noel caused enough of a distraction to take some of the heat off my back.
We're glad to help. But we're the ones who should be thanking you. It's encouraging to have you here with us.
Now, the thing is, between this and the earlier resolution problem that I mentioned in Cold Steel 3 that got patched, I get the distinct impression that these ports are somehow ports of the Switch release. Granted, this is pure speculation, I'm just spitballing here, but it would make sense since the Switch version is a NISA-made and controlled port that they would probably be able to use to cut down on development costs for these ports. This isn't really a good or a bad thing because it really shouldn't affect anything too much, especially with how they are showing that these ports do have the PS4 console settings. But it is something to take note of and think about. All in all, these ports are kinda disappointing. Ys 9's was a bit boring and hardly an upgrade, while Ys 8's had some cool improvements, but also a few problems to go with them, most of which have been fixed now. But with these Cold Steel 3 and 4 ports, we've kind of got a worst of both worlds situations going on. They're a bit boring, and they have problems that need ironing out. It's a case where, personally, I still just recommend the PS4 versions over the PS5 unless they're ludicrously expensive where you are for whatever reason. And if you're thinking of double dipping, it is most definitely not worth the upgrade, and if you really want to squeeze some better visuals out of the game, just go to the PC version. Luckily, from this point onwards, all PS5 ports from Falcom are going to be made in-house, and alongside the other versions that come out as well, so porting bugs are not likely going to be a thing in future releases. So rest easy knowing that you can look forward to Trails Through Daybreak and Ys 10.